Good morning, everyone. My name is Nikki Lame. I'm an assistant professor here in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies Department, and it is a pleasure to see all of your faces. It's exciting to have you all here. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our first speaker for today, Julie Livingston, the Julius Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and Professor of History at New York University. Author of 3 books, the most recent co-authored with Andrew Ross, Cars and Jails, Freedom Dreams, Debt and Carcerality. Julie Livingston is a historian, yes, a South Africanist, yes, a transnational thinker, yes, a 2013 recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, so she's a genius. But I wanted to flag that she's also an ethnographer. When you read Livingston's work, you experience someone who can at once hold the broader global context of issues such as cancer management, environmental and public health consequences of capitalism and economic growth, various kinds of relationships between species, while helping us to see how those processes are understood and felt in the local contemporary context. In improvising medicine and self-devouring growth, for example, she places Botswana in the middle, right? Botswana in the middle of, at the center of the world, I might argue. And thinking about our planet's water crisis and placing Botswana in the middle, Livingston writes, quote, Botswana is a place with a long history of political philosophy and debate, a moral imagination expressed in public health practice, whose foundational category is rain. I want to take this imagination and this knowledge seriously as political modality, not in a quest for authenticity, but rather as another source from which alternative possibilities for planetary politics might be envisioned, end quote. Professor Livingston's work interrogates a number of fascinating questions about the body as a moral condition, a mode of experience, African thought and political and moral imagination, financial debt and cars, automobility. And she's also an ethnographer, having explored all these questions not only through the archives, meticulous sociological data, but also on the ground with the people who, following E. Patrick Johnson, are on the street, any place where the racialized, sexualized body is beaten, starved, fired, cursed, indeed where the body is the site of trauma, end quote. And I'll add here that not only where the body is the site of trauma, at least in the case of Julie Livingston's work, but it's also where the body is the site of improvisation, imagining new possibilities, also where the body is the site of pain and laughter. I keep bringing up ethnography because that's what I do, you know, but y'all know I say that I do this all the time. But because it's also my firm belief that when we go to the sites, it lends a different shape to our theorizing. And Livingston's work offers us such a clear example of what precisely can happen when ethnography is done well. In Self-Devouring Growth, we see what Livingston does so beautifully throughout her work. She shows us ourselves. In Self-Devouring Growth, she does this through parable, and she says, quote, wherever you sit reading this, you are in a world organized by self-devouring growth. It is so fundamental as to be unremarkable, and yet it is eating away at the very ground beneath our feet. Because self-devouring growth is everywhere, a term she uses, quote, to quote, refer to the ways that the superorganism of human beings is consuming itself, end quote, we can at once sit in the specificity of its happening while reminding ourselves that we are eating ourselves too. The title of her talk today is Suicide, Environmental Degradation, and the Material Politics of Difficult Feelings. I don't know what Livingston will do in this talk this morning, but I know it will be shaped by the fact that she is also an ethnographer. Please join me by welcoming Julie Livingston.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much to Nikki for that intro. Can you hear me? I feel like a little echo. Nobody else can hear the echo? Okay, great. All right. You know, welcome to the inside of my head. It's just a big fucking echo. Okay. So thank you to Nikki. Thank you to Jennifer Nash for the super generous invitation. Thank you to Julie Winmore for all her help in arranging my trip. Thank you to all the organizers who make this workshop possible. Thank you to my friends and my chosen family, some of whom are here today. I know how much labor it takes to put on an event like this, and I think it's really important that people gather face to face sometimes. So I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to be here and to think together. I learned so much yesterday from Grace and from Jaspir. I cannot wait. I would just want to hurry through it so I can get to Kevin Kwashi. So let me get started. In the long shadow of the event, which is already the prelude to the next event, life is proving unbearable for some. Following the wildfires and the heat dome in British Columbia in 2021, an emergency room doctor reported that she saw a spate of suicide attempts by young people, driven by the fear that they will never outlive the climate disasters and global warming. In Puerto Rico, for more than a year following Hurricane Maria, the suicide rate rose precipitously, as did the call volume to the suicide hotline. Clinical psychologist Dr. Carlos del Toro Ortiz reported that in his 2 decades of clinical practice, he had never before hospitalized as many people with suicidal or homicidal thoughts in such a short period of time as in the 2 months following the storm. One grandmother told him about her recurrent and terrifying memories of the storm itself, mixed with feelings of anguish at the visceral experience of her home, her possessions, caked in filth, rotting in the heat. She too was having disturbing thoughts of suicide and was worried she might harm herself. But even without the event, the slow wasting of the landscape provokes deep feelings of loss, anxiety, outrage, and pain. In 2018, David Buckle, a 60-year-old white gay man who ran one of the largest carbon-neutral composting sites in the country, headed into Brooklyn's Prospect Park, where he proceeded to drench himself with gasoline and set himself ablaze to publicly protest the lack of climate action. Readers and columnists alike in the news media debated the nature and futility of David Buckle's death, as well as that of another environmentalist self-immolator a few years later. Some people opined how fruitless these acts were, a failed strategy destined to make nary a ripple in the political currents of climate activity. Others said this was evidence of mental illness and should not be glorified or politicized as something more. But many readers wrote into the comments section that they understood the dread, the grief, the anguish that had motivated these men. Their actions, while extreme, surfaced a zeitgeist of sorts. I know this feeling. When my father died mid-pandemic and we gathered to say the Kaddish, I remember thinking him lucky. He'd lived his long life. Now he'd be spared bearing witness to the ongoing, unfolding violence to come. The water wars, constitutive of what Jaspir just described yesterday. The crass commodification of breathable air, the ever-expanding sacrifice zones, the militarization of the cobalt and lithium economies, the last panda in a gilded cage, its DNA extracted and preserved for posterity, while some white supremacists blast off to found a slave colony on Mars. These moments offer glimpses into the wide range of climate-related suicide that mark the deadly and I believe escalating psychic toll of our contemporary predicament. In this talk with you, I am asking how climate change, a welter of incremental corrosive shifts layered with sudden catastrophic events, generated and perpetuated through violent industrial systems of profit, can get under the skin and into what I am calling the embodied mind. I'm asking, as Anne Cvickovic might put it, what does the dwindling of the world feel like? And how do people endure or enact those feelings? This is a widespread phenomena that I am tracing. Endurance and enactment abound, from Indian and African farmers awash in pesticide and debt, to those in the rubber boats balancing on the brutal ridge of abyss and future. But here today with you, I'm focused here at home, my home, the United States. My central argument is this. The environmental transformation underway is affecting suicide in two registers. One is external. Environmental degradation creates life conditions that challenge people's ability or desire to endure. The other is internal. Environmental degradation happens out there at the scale of the runoff of the pork processing plant, at the scale of the hurricane, the wildfire, but it also happens inside of us at the molecular level. So the subject of history is a moving target, constantly conditioned and reconditioned by these new formulations. And in turn, that contingent subject is part of the transforming environment itself. At every instance, the boundary between internal and external collapses, leaving us in a state of profound indeterminacy as we try to capture how these transforming systems and transforming bodies that are co-constitutive of one another are going to produce a predictable outcome. This indeterminacy means that I am also arguing against linear modes of causation and for complexity in our efforts to grasp the relationship between environmental degradation and suicide. Later in my talk, I'll offer a few examples to show how the subject that I'm talking about is formed. Climate grief, eco-anxiety, solastalgia. The mental health community is proliferating new terms, new diagnoses to capture widespread feelings of nostalgia for a lost landscape, fear, outrage, and profound sadness. But these feelings are not new. At the very dawn of capitalism, what did it feel like in the fetid hold of the ship as the mangroves and the red soil slipped away, when finally one could no longer hear the go-away bird make its call? Some West Africans tucked grains of rice and seed into their hair, interspeciated companions, tools to survive the very loss of the world, plants to propagate their very aliveness. But some, recognizing they had been seized by cannibals, a deep insight that we should pause with, leapt from the deck into the sea. What did it feel like when the colonizers killed the buffalo by the millions, their silent bodies lying in great rotting heaps? When they took the land entirely, depleting it into a husk, pouring poison into its veins? Many have borne that and more, and along the way, some have taken their own lives. These feelings are also rooted in the more recent history of what Jackie Orr calls psychopower. In her book on panic disorder, she offers a genealogy of this diagnostic category, showing how in the US, public feelings of anxiety and panic are cultivated as private property and then attended to as pathology at the confluence of pharma, state, and science. Joe Masco, in turn, explains how nuclear annihilation and climate emergency both share in this genealogy. He teaches us to ask, whose interests are served by futility as a collective mood? In thinking these feelings now, I'm tracing an additional dimension. By approaching pervasive feelings of climate grief and anxiety as the combined social, political, economic, and biochemical effects of environmental degradation. This means approaching despair at the level of the person who recognizes political abandonment, but also at the cellular level in a body that is already transformed and conditioned by environmental change, what feminist science studies scholar M. Murphy terms alter life, even as we scale up to account for the political economy in which that body, that life, is situated. In other words, I'm asking for us to embrace an enhanced understanding of biochemistry as a political force, one that operates in part through debilitation. Much of the data that I will work with here in order to flesh this out for you is epidemiological. Sorry, I'm trained in public health, I'm a nerd. Okay, it establishes correlation but not causation. It can tell you what's associated with what, but not the mechanism by which it's caused. So it gives us entry points from which to raise questions and perceive relationships. Suicide and environmental devastation are correlated and entangled in troubling ways. A significant body of epidemiological data demonstrates, for example, that suicides surge in the aftermath of catastrophic climate events. But they also calibrate in a much more finessed way to rising rates of air pollution, to temperature rise, to the chemical exposures that have become our steady state. The we that I invoke in this talk is an effort to recognize some shared systems, a shared material and chemical world, some experiences that traverse steep inclines of power but do not efface them, relationships that drift across or link territory. This we is a rhetorical move toward responsibility to others. This is not the royal we. This is not a resuscitation of the corrupt figure of humanism's universal subject. I am not suggesting that climate change is the same for everyone, everywhere, nor am I saying that people are equally positioned vis-a-vis suicide, its motivations, or its significance. This we is a political community of mutual responsibility, a commons that I wish to call into being. Vanessa Agar-Jones, working in Martinique, names how human bodies are caught up in and produced through scalar systems of colonial power. And it is to her, in part, that my talk owes its title. Building on Trujillo's earlier work, she terms her analytic bodies in the system, tracing how an endocrine disrupting chemical moves from industrial agriculture on the island through, and this is a quote, bodies as multiply constituted things, as blendings of companion species and inorganic material, containing multiple forms of agency, bearing the traces of multiple forms of power, end quote. Following Agar-Jones, can we consider the embodied mind tilting towards self-harm along similar lines? This embodied mind is always, already biological and social. It is always, already in and of an environment that's social, political, and economic, as well as biochemical. I choose suicide as my object of concern because it's an act or an idea, not a diagnosis. And I want some room to think beyond psychiatric categories. For some time now, a psychiatric paradigm has held primacy in the field of suicidology. But given that more than half of all Americans will receive a diagnosis of mental illness or disorder in their lifetime, and that in any given year, 1 in 5 of us are experiencing a mental illness designation, perhaps we should pay more attention to the anti-political work this category is doing. In recognizing that affect is the body's response to the world, feminist and queer affect theorists have cautioned us against pathologizing emotions, rendering them as some form of damaged private property. They point instead toward the politics of public feelings. Following them, I ask after the political implications of despair, not to deny the reality of psychic distress, far from it, but instead to ask what happens if we approach these pervasive thoughts and acts of self-harm as a meaningful response to our political, ethical, and planetary condition. The effects of pathologizing psychic anguish in this country are powerful, considering that our mental health services are painfully thin on the ground, racialized, carceral, gendered, and heavily pharmaceuticalized. The pathologization of suicide sidesteps the deeper question that Jasbir poses in her work on debility and capacity. She asks, and this is a quote, what kinds of slow death have been ongoing from which suicide might represent an escape? In her final book, Lauren Berlant made an important distinction between the suicidal imagination and acts of self-harm. Suicidation, she explained, quote, is neither an expression of an identity nor a plan. It is a register in which the labor of managing the work of living uneasily as a social problem or as a being battered by the ordinary of contingency and crisis imprints itself on consciousness. Sometimes suicidation is executed in suicide, but usually it marks the sense of the unendurable that is endured and the work of holding things together while feeling that they might not hold and that life as it is known might not either, end quote. This is an absolutely crucial distinction that's often blurred in suicidology, the arts of endurance as versus a move to self-annihilation. Both work through suicide, but toward radically different ends. But what happens to our understanding of endurance when we center it on environmental degradation? When we recognize that embodied minds develop and exist in this late capitalist system in which biological life is forever constitutionally altered by the exposures that precede it. Harmful exposures are maldistributed along familiar patterns of racial and colonial harm. But the insidiousness of the petrochemical regime means that we are so awash in this shit that there is a baseline toxic embrace that touches everyone at the molecular level by now. Consider that SSRIs, the most commonly prescribed class of antidepressants, come with warning labels because in some instances, they can coax suicidation into suicidal action, turning endurance into its very opposite. Could other chemicals, unwelcome ones that we passively consume, do the same? How might the passively consumed combine with the purposefully ingested? In other words, how might the chemical and the political work together to foster thoughts and actions of self-destruction? Think about the fact that effluviant from the petrochemical industry can carry mood and mind-altering effects at the same time as planet-warming carbon. So can we approach suicide through a dense web of ethical, political, and ecological connections that exceed any individuated diagnostic or therapeutic address? Suicide's the second leading cause of death among young people in this country. In a recent report, our Surgeon General noted that over the decade leading up to the pandemic, so that's not including the crisis itself, The proportion of high school students reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness had increased by 40%. The depth and urgency of these feelings is captured in truly devastating statistics. In 2019, again on the eve of the pandemic, 1 in 5 youth had seriously considered attempting suicide, 1 in 6 had made a plan, 1 in 11 had made an attempt, 1 in 40 had made an attempt requiring medical treatment in a hospital. In 2018, some 95,000 young people aged 14 to 18 entered the emergency room in the US to treat injuries from self-harm. The pandemic has only deepened matters. The CDC reported that in 2021, 1 in 3 high school girls reported they had seriously considered suicide. More than 1 in 5, close to a quarter, of LGBTQ youth had made an attempt in the previous year. But young people are not alone. Despair abounds across the life course. 46,000 people took their own lives in 2020, amid 1.2 million documented attempts. And so these are obviously undercounting of the action itself, given the ambiguities around suicide. The psychiatric establishment speaks of a gender paradox in the act. Men kill themselves in much higher numbers than women, but women contemplate suicide more often and make more attempts. Native American and Pacific Islanders have the highest overall rates in this country, followed by white people. But the suicide rate for Black children under the age of 13, which is a phrase almost too painful to bear, is double that for their white peers. And over the past 2 years, the suicide rate has risen among Native American, Latin American, and Black Americans. The majority of gun deaths in this land of deadly weapons are suicides. There is so much to endure here alongside the loss of familiar landscape and companion species amid the anxious uncertainty of the ecological future. National credit card debt stands at approximately $1 trillion. Nearly half of us are unable to cover an unanticipated $400 emergency expense. There are well over 650,000 people in this country who lack a home. Children grow up rehearsing how to hide in silence with their schoolmates from armed gunmen against a routinized spectacle of mass murder, suicide, enacted over and over and over again by a figure of damaged masculinity. We witnessed in futile panic on our cell phones and tablets as bystanders were unable to stop the state from lynching George Floyd as he called out for his mother. The image burned in our collective memory. On our computers and televisions, we witness people trapped in the rubble of the Gazan cage, dazed, bloodied, parched, hungry beyond measure. Yet we have not stopped the bombs that we bought from dropping on them. Psychotropic drugs are in widespread use from boarding schools, universities, gated communities, to nursing homes, jails, prisons, and migrant detention centers. There they are deployed as what Anthony Ryan Hatch terms chemical restraints, harnessing the body to ease its own capture. Meanwhile, the larger murder-suicide spiral of self-devouring growth that is environmental degradation continues unabated. The world itself is mad. Some people have been honing the arts of endurance for many centuries. Some are just learning anew. Many are falling through the cracks. In other words, I am not arguing that widespread feelings and even acts of political abjection are purely environmental. That would be facile, and I do not believe in singular causes. But how does this deadly structure of feeling exceed the social? How can we think political subjectivity at the interface of the environment? Why do environmental data correlate to the suicide rate? One meta-analysis by a team of Iranian and American scientists found that when concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, so these are three byproducts of fossil fuel generation, when they rise in the atmosphere, so does the suicide rate for the next several days. Researchers have also begun to document relationships between rising average temperatures in a given month and the suicide rate. They just correlate all too perfectly. One large study analyzing data from thousands of counties and municipalities in Mexico and the US over the course of 4 decades found that as average temperatures increase, so do suicides in those locales. We don't know the specific mechanisms that account for this correlation. Did the difference come from within the suicidal body or from the world without? But maybe that's the wrong question. We do know that authors did not find that people adapted over time. The relationship between suicide and temperature continued to escalate. Nor did they find that people from hotter or cooler climates were better able to cope with rising averages. Income differences, shockingly, had no bearing on the relationship, nor did higher rates of air conditioning. So let me give you 2 examples of feedback loops. The first is around housing, the second is around pharmaceuticals, to help illustrate the counterintuitive ways that suicide and climate are entangled through the embodied mind in the late capitalist system. In each one, the biochemical accumulates with the socioeconomic and the political to necessitate endurance, to prod existential threat. Against the background of pervasive despair and creeping anxiety, broken institutions, and widespread toxicity, a temporal cycle of routinized climate events unfolds. Wildfire season, hurricane season, summer heat waves have become an annual lottery. Some are flattened by it, fleeing, coping, navigating a familiar landscape, now rendered unpredictable and perilous. The sudden destruction of the everyday mixes with the exhaustion of managing in the present, the anxiety of an uncertain future, the loss of a nostalgic past. An estimated 50% of the survivors of Hurricane Katrina had PTSD. And even those who fled the storm itself but returned to live among the debris were overwhelmed by the miles of devastated landscape. They're missing friends, families, pets, their drowned homes. Trauma can be a much abused term, but here I mean specifically that for some time after the storm, an enormous number of people found themselves irritable and more prone to aggression, unable to sleep, living constantly vigilant against new threats, and were understandably more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. The suicide rate was nearly triple what it had been before the storm, and it stayed higher than normal for years. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, similar anguish. People were traumatized. They'd been through a terrifying ordeal. They were separated from loved ones, unsure of their whereabouts or condition, facing ongoing deprivation. Familiar markers on the landscape were transformed, and days stretched into weeks, into months, into years, without electricity, running water, basic services, assistance. The burden of private property, the thinness and false promise of state services, the collapsed safety nets, the ongoing insult of colonial neglect and profiteering, which continues unabated. The feeling of abandonment proved too much for some. Suicidologists have long established statistical correlations between suicide and financial stresses like employment, crushing debt, foreclosure. And in turn, some have shown that generous social safety nets help mitigate these effects. Climate crises push deep into fault lines created already by widespread financial debt, as people might suddenly and simultaneously lose their employment, their housing, their personal possessions, and find themselves facing a bevy of unforeseen expenses. Housing offers a way to contemplate the complex array of environmental dynamics that interact with the economic and the social of devastation. If, when the storm comes, you're a property owner with a mortgage, I'm here to tell you that bill keeps coming even though you can't live in your home. And you now face the overwhelming financial uncertainty in a possession which you may previously have experienced as a form of security. If you're a renter, where will you go in a city or town whose housing stock has just been brutally shrunk? How much more will you pay? How much more can you pay? If you were already homeless, well, many New Orleans residents returned to homes with black mold creeping across surfaces, crawling inside the walls. This is an environmental problem that follows in the wake of flooding. It can be exacerbated by rising temperatures. Mold exposure is associated with negative mental health consequences. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, researchers at Rutgers found that adults in New Jersey who were exposed to mold due to storm damage experienced twice the rate of mental distress as people who were not so exposed. In my city, New York, where 1 out of every 15 of us resides in public housing, NYCHA buildings were rife with toxic mold for years. In New Orleans, people were moved into FEMA trailers that they later learned emitted formaldehyde, a chemical associated with depression, panic attacks, and cognitive impairment. Of course, many predominantly Black, low-income New Orleans residents were already living in toxic buildings, including, infamously, the Press Park public housing development erected by the city on a waste dump, later named a Superfund site. In the aftermath, of course it's not just the flood. Research suggests potential neurotoxic effects from exposure to wildfire smoke, complete with the chemicals emitted from the plastics and other synthetic materials burned when the fire consumes the American home. In the aftermath of such a storm or a fire come the drugs necessary to manage the shock and the stress. They join the drugs that are already our collective steady state. The past several decades have seen a large-scale turn to pharmaceuticals to tend to disruptions of the embodied mind, including those related to climate anxiety, climate grief, and related effects. The global market in psychopharmaceuticals has a projected value of $50 billion in 2020. That's the latest statistic I found, and continues to rise. I want to be clear that I am not anti-drug per se. I have a half a Xanax in me. There's no way I could stand in a big room like that without one. Nor do I think that drugs are the root cause of our predicament, because again, I don't believe in singular causes. But the mass drugging of the population has done little to stem the tide of suicide, and in fact, as a technopolitics, it furthers the problem in the name of its solution. Consider again SSRIs, this popular class of antidepressants, that they cause emotional blunting in approximately half of the many, many millions of people who take these drugs. That means that while those pills can, thankfully, relieve the emotional pain of depression, they also reduce emotional pleasure. And this reduction of our enjoyment in the world is an effect of how the drug impedes the ways that we learn from our environment. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans over the age of 18 is taking a prescribed psychotropic drug, the culmination of a decades-long escalation in diagnostic creep and prescription response. For children, those developing organisms, the rate is higher. A large-scale study of nearly 9 million children aged 2 to 17 in 2019 found that on average, 27 to 28% were taking a prescribed psychotropic medication. One study in Southeast Texas found, not surprisingly, that more than 1 in 3 children in foster care is receiving at least one such drug, and many, far more, in combination. For everyone, these drugs are approved for use based on clinical trials that follow their effects as single agents over a short time span. Yet many people consume these drugs whose biological mechanism remains unknown in perpetuity and in combination. So sometimes, actually quite often, drugs are added to drugs are added to drugs in a polypharmaceutical cascade from which it is difficult to break free. As humans consume psychotropic drugs in escalating rates, we then excrete these chemicals and their metabolites back into our environment. There, they persist and accumulate over time. Psychiatric drugs abound in our aqueous environments. They're sedimented into the sludge, the soil. They are in the tissue of aquatic biota. These drugs have effects on aquatic life. They inhibit the stress response in fish. They affect the locomotor and reproductive systems of mollusks and crustaceans. In other words, the efforts to blunt our feelings through drugs have knock-on effects that harm our fellow species on the planet, ultimately contributing to the source of solastalgia. The Xanax I took to give this talk, like the Wellbutrin you may have taken to hear it, will not be thoroughly cleared through Durham's municipal wastewater treatment system and will eventually enter local creeks that feed into streams and lakes where it will be taken up by algae, phytoplankton, insects, mollusks, and eventually various species of fish. And then these same drugs and their metabolites are also feeding back into our own human biochemistry. They're in our tap water. They're in the sludge that becomes our agricultural fertilizer. They're in the fish. They're in the soil. One secondary analysis of pharmaceutical residue in drinking water in Europe and North America found that if a pregnant person drinks an average of 2 liters of tap water per day, they'll have a cumulative ingestion of 5% of the clinical dose of Valium over the course of their pregnancy. Unfortunately, scientific expertise is siloed. There is little transdisciplinary conversation between medicine, neuroscience, aquatic toxicology. But emerging research suggests potential effects on human health. The science that currently governs the dispensing of these drugs does not account for potential bioaccumulation in fish, does not account for exposure in utero, or other subclinical registers of accumulation or chronic exposure, much less synergies across chemical agents. We can expand the system in which the embodied mind is located to take in pharmaceutical production, an industry that is more emissions intensive than automobile manufacturing. It is a profoundly dirty industry. Take Puerto Rico again, for example, where over the protests of community groups, tax breaks to pharma totaling $14.5 billion annually, which is more than the Puerto Rican government's annual operating budget, have made the island into the 3rd largest biotech manufacturer globally. Currently, more than 50 pharmaceutical plants operate in Puerto Rico. They produce a range of top-selling drugs for cancer, arthritis, heart disease, autoimmunity, and more, including pharmaceuticals like Prozac. Pharmaceutical manufacturing has produced 15 EPA Superfund sites on the archipelago. I think we can expect more coming down the line. Toxic waste from the production process has polluted the aquifer, tainting the well water that many rely on, especially in the wake of Hurricane Maria that destroyed the island's water system. Pharmaceutical runoff flows into fresh water systems. It feeds into the sea. There, it's led to significant die-offs of fish stock in local waters, in turn hampering livelihoods. Meanwhile, people living near the pharmaceutical plants have high rates of cancer and asthma. Meta-analyses find that patients with asthma, in turn, have a significantly increased rate of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide mortality. Among adolescents, asthmatics have more than double the risk of suicide as non-asthmatics. And of course, in the American system of abandonment and profiteering through the debt economy, chronic illnesses like cancer and asthma impoverish people, draining their livelihood right back into the medical industrial complex, of which that pharmaceutical system is a key player, and making medical debt another chronic, debilitating condition of life. Debt, chronic pain, no stable home in which to rest, gather, the panic of a child gasping for breath, fish belly up in the river, children separated from their families and drugged into submission, tainted water. Endurance is hard, and for some, uncertain work. In an essay on suicide in the age of nuclear weapons, Robert J. Lifton made a crucial distinction between depression and despair. He stressed that it's despair, a feeling of futurelessness, that is at issue in suicide. And he went on to contemplate the relationship between individual despair and self-destruction and the collective scale of futurelessness that nuclearity threatens. Lifton points to a paradox of vitality at the heart of the agentive nature of suicide, in which the subject is both murderer and victim. And he urges readers to contemplate the relationship between the individual and collective scale of despair and potential futurelessness. This is a quote. "What we learn in our exploration of individual suicide," he writes, "if applied wisely, might contribute to the desperately needed imaginative efforts to confront the imagery of nuclear extinction on behalf of rejecting and preventing that fate. It is my hope that a similar promise might lie in thinking about suicide in the shadow of climate change, and that such thinking may contribute toward the reorientation of vitality, both individual and collective. At its largest scale, climate change is a gross act of murder-suicide, unfolding in broad daylight, orchestrated and furthered by powerful interests, scrambling rationality and irrationality. Can we unpack these necropolitics to understand their mechanisms with an aim of dismantling them? What comes after cruel optimism? What happens when there's so much cruelty, yet the optimism, the implicit progressive futurity, has evaporated from the relationships it used to lubricate? I think this is another form of what Jaspir was talking about when she was referring to the Israeli state with no fig leaf anymore, right? That's the new moment that we are in. What kind of vitality might be possible for embodied minds in this system? How can we tend to our worlds and organize our aftermath such that people can endure its exhausting present, bear its uncertain future, create a world worthy of all the love and mutuality that we have. Ecological grief and climate anxiety might serve to motivate people toward action that's reparative, mentally, politically, but such feelings can also incapacitate and drain into futility. So this is the conclusion where I'm supposed to name the solution. The route out of the murder-suicide. But what I want to name is so obvious, and yet it feels so out of reach. So I'm already standing here worried that you're going to feel unsatisfied and overwhelmed. I know that the capitalist system, which is a racialized system of profit and a gendered one, at every single turn, that system that generates our climate predicament has also transformed the body at the molecular level, even as it has brought intensive social, political, and economic pressures on the mind. I think that if the interior milieu and the exterior environment are co-constituted, we must address this psychic anguish and despair in ways that build a political collective, rather than through a depoliticizing narrative of individual pathology. Such an effort will require a new science, a feminist science, one that refuses linearity and siloing, but recognizes that social and biological reproduction are two sides of the very same coin. It would be a science of the subclinical as well as the symptomatic. I realized listening to Jen Nash yesterday, this would be a science of uncertainty, of ambiguity. This would be a science following the brilliant Vanessa Agar-Jones of Bodies in the System, a science that refuses to separate the rent bill from the effects of black mold, the car loan from the car exhaust, human biochemistry from that of mollusks in our shared ecosystem, a science that does not cleave drugs into the body from those excreted out of the body, a science that does not engage in the fantasy of beginning with a pure body and a clinical threshold, but instead starts from an already exposed body in relation to other already exposed bodies, navigating broken institutions. But how can even the most capacious science be realized in a meaningful politics of redress? These questions came to me as an extension of a book I wrote about self-devouring growth. Self-devouring growth names a massive murder-suicidal formation of capitalism, one that hinges on an everyday inability to make sense of ourselves in the world. And I believe that the alternative to this massive murder-suicide, at least a first step, and there are many first steps, I'm not foreclosing others, I'm naming mine, is called degrowth. Degrowth is the opposite of austerity. It is a theory and a system for the provision of basic needs like housing, transportation, childcare, elder care, green space, either as municipal commons or highly enhanced public goods, such that the arenas structured by private consumption and choice scale back. It names a politics that refuses the alibi of growth. Instead, it promises the cutting away, the shrinking, the scaling back of the violent accumulation by the elite and corporate capital, shaving their power over and over and over again, even while we foster new forms of political subjectivity. It is a strategy for how to approach abolition. Abolition of the military-industrial complex, and you recall that the US military is the institution with the largest carbon footprint on this planet. a scaling back, a shrinking until a radical abolition of the prison-industrial complex, of the fucked up debt society that we are supposed to live in, of a politics of consumption, and toward a reprioritization of the things that genuinely matter to us. We can either choose a deliberate path out of our present disposition and build a healthier and more just world, a commons. I believe that commons is another term, again, for the land back that Jasper referred to yesterday. It's not a frictionless fantasy of something. It's a realpolitik of who we are, where we're at, and what our capacities can and should be. I think if we don't do that, the destruction is only going to grow. So that's what we must work toward together with our embodied minds if we are to disarm this murder-suicide that is ongoing in broad daylight. Thank you.